Most people don't start with Schopenhauer because they're depressed. They end up agreeing with him after they've lived long enough to notice something doesn't quite add up. It usually begins in a very ordinary way. You want something, you work toward it, you imagine how it will feel once you finally get there. And then you do get there. For a moment, it feels right, maybe even better than expected. But that feeling doesn't stay. It fades quietly, almost politely, and you return to yourself as if nothing permanent really changed. Not in a dramatic way, just enough to make you pause and wonder why it didn't last the way you thought it would. That small moment is where Schopenhauer begins to feel convincing. Because what he says doesn't sound abstract. It sounds like he is describing something you already recognize. He takes that simple pattern and gives it a much heavier meaning. He says this is not just something that happens sometimes. This is the structure of life itself. You desire, you struggle, you get what you want, and then the satisfaction disappears, pushing you back into wanting again. A cycle that never really ends. And when you first hear that, it feels honest. It feels like someone finally stopped pretending that things lead somewhere stable. The problem is not that this pattern is false. You can see it in your own life. The problem is what happens when that pattern becomes the main explanation for everything. Schopenhauer does not just point at the cycle. He builds a complete worldview out of it. He treats desire as a force that keeps you trapped, always reaching but never arriving. He treats satisfaction as something temporary by nature, not just in practice. And once you accept that, it begins to change how you approach life before anything even happens. You start carrying an expectation into every situation. Not a loud expectation, but a quiet one in the background. That whatever you are doing will not fully satisfy you. That whatever you are working toward will eventually feel like everything else. And that expectation slowly changes your level of involvement. You still act, you still move forward, you still want things, but part of you is already holding back, already prepared for the moment when the feeling fades. This is where something subtle shifts. You're no longer just experiencing life. You are anticipating its limitations. And that anticipation removes something important. Because a lot of intensity comes from the possibility that something might actually matter in a lasting way. That it might change you, or complete something, or shift your experience in a deeper sense. But if you've already accepted that nothing will do that, then everything starts to feel slightly reduced before it even begins. You become more controlled, more measured, more careful about how much you invest in anything. That can look like maturity. It can look like emotional intelligence. But it can also be distance. You are involved, but not completely. You are present, but not fully inside what is happening. There's always a small gap between you and the experience, and that gap feels like understanding. This is where Schopenhauer's thinking quietly reshapes your life. He does not force you into despair. He does something more subtle. He teaches you to see dissatisfaction as the most important signal. He teaches you to treat repetition as proof that nothing truly builds into something lasting. And once you start seeing life through that lens, everything begins to organize itself around it. Moments of joy feel temporary before they even pass. Moments of excitement feel like setups for disappointment. Moments of meaning become something you question instead of fully entering. Over time, this creates a kind of flattening. Not dramatic, not obvious, but consistent. Life continues, but it feels less alive, less charged, less capable of surprising you, because you believe you already understand the pattern. You expect the ending before the experience has fully unfolded, and that expectation slowly limits how deeply you allow yourself to feel anything. This is the part people rarely question. They assume that seeing the pattern clearly means they are seeing reality as it is. But there is another possibility. They are not seeing more. They're seeing through a narrowed frame. Schopenhauer takes something real and elevates it into a total explanation. But real life is not built from one pattern alone. It moves in different directions. It contradicts itself. It contains moments that do not fit into a single loop. When you reduce everything to that loop, you don't just understand life differently. You begin to live it differently. You filter your experiences through that expectation. You reinterpret moments so they match the pattern. You stop noticing what doesn't fit. And slowly, the philosophy stops being something you think about. It becomes something you live inside. And that is where the real question begins. Not whether Schopenhauer was completely wrong, but whether he saw only one side of something much larger and then treated that side as the whole truth. Because if that is the case, then what feels like deep understanding might actually be a kind of limitation. Not one that traps you obviously, but one that quietly reduces how much of life you're willing to fully experience. Once that lens settles in, it doesn't stay as an idea you think about occasionally. It becomes something you carry into ordinary moments without noticing. You start relating to your own experience differently, especially in situations that used to feel simple. You sit with friends, you work towards something, you enjoy a brief moment of success, and somewhere in the background there's a quiet awareness that this will pass, that it will not hold, that it will return you to the same place it always does. Nothing dramatic changes on the outside, but something shifts in how deeply you allow yourself to be inside those moments. You begin to measure less by what something is and more by how long it will last. And because you already believe the answer is not long, the value of the moment starts to feel reduced while you are still inside it. You are experiencing it and stepping away from it at the same time. There's always a small distance, a kind of mental step back that keeps you from fully settling into what is happening. It feels like awareness, like you're no longer being carried away by illusions, but it also prevents you from being fully moved by anything. This is where Schopenhauer's idea starts to quietly reshape your emotional range. Not by removing feelings, but by softening their impact. You still feel things, but less completely. You don't rise as high, but you also don't fall as deeply. And at first, that can feel like control. It can feel like you become more stable, less reactive, less dependent on outcomes. But over time, something else becomes noticeable. That stability comes with a cost. You're not just avoiding the lows. You're also reducing the highs. And because this happens gradually, it is easy to mistake it for growth. You tell yourself you're becoming more realistic, more grounded, more aware of how things actually work. But what you might actually be doing is narrowing the range of what you allow yourself to experience. You are pre-adjusting your expectations so that nothing can disappoint you too much, but in doing that, nothing can fully engage you either. This is where the idea of desire becomes especially important. Schopenhauer treats desire as something that traps you, something that keeps you in a loop of wanting and dissatisfaction. And again, there is truth in that. Desire can pull you into cycles that don't resolve. But what gets lost is that desire is also what pulls you into life in the first place. It is what gives movement to your actions, energy to your decisions, direction to your attention. When you start seeing desire primarily as a problem, you begin to weaken that energy, not by removing it completely, but by approaching it with hesitation. You want something, but you also question whether it's worth wanting. You feel drawn towards something, but you also remind yourself that it won't last. And that internal conflict reduces the force behind your actions. You move forward, but with less momentum. You commit, but with a part of you already pulling back. And that creates a kind of half engagement that is difficult to notice from the inside. You're still doing things, still making progress, still participating in your life, but something about it feels slightly muted. Like you're never fully leaning into anything, never fully allowing yourself to be carried by it. This is where the philosophy begins to feel heavier than it first appeared, because it doesn't just describe suffering. It changes how you relate to everything that might have mattered to you. It teaches you to be cautious about investing too much meaning into anything, because it assumes that meaning will always collapse back into dissatisfaction. And that assumption becomes a kind of quiet rule. Don't expect too much. Don't attach too deeply. Don't believe it will last. Those rules protect you in one sense. They reduce the intensity of disappointment. They make you less vulnerable to being thrown off balance when things don't go as expected. But they also remove something else. They remove the possibility of being fully involved in something without holding back. Because full involvement always carries risk. It means you allow something to matter without immediately questioning it. It means you give your attention, your energy, your time without constantly stepping back to evaluate whether it is worth it in the long run. And that kind of involvement is exactly what Schopenhauer's framework makes more difficult. You become too aware of the pattern to fully surrender to the moment. And over time, this creates a very specific kind of life. One that is stable, controlled, and relatively protected from extreme disappointment, but also one that feels slightly distant, slightly reduced, slightly less alive than it could be. You don't collapse into despair. You level out. And that leveling out feels like wisdom because it is supported by a clear explanation. You understand why things don't last. You understand why desire returns. You understand why satisfaction fades. But understanding something is not the same as experiencing it fully. And this is where the limitation becomes clearer. Schopenhauer turns a pattern into a conclusion, and then that conclusion becomes a filter that shapes how you experience everything else. You don't just see the cycle. You begin to live as if the cycle is the only thing that matters. And once that happens, it becomes harder to notice anything that doesn't fit into that pattern. Moments that carry deeper meaning are quickly reduced to temporary states. Experiences that could have expanded your sense of life are interpreted as variations of the same loop. You bring everything back to the same explanation. And when everything leads to the same place, it starts to feel like nothing truly goes anywhere at all. And this is the point where everything needs to turn, because if you stop here, then Schopenhauer really does win. His view becomes the final lens, the quiet conclusion sitting behind everything you do. Life becomes something you understand, something you manage, something you move through carefully without expecting too much from it. And on the surface, that can look like wisdom. You're no longer easily fooled. You are no longer chasing things blindly. You're no longer surprised when satisfaction fades. You have seen the pattern and you have accepted it. But there's a problem hiding inside that acceptance. It assumes that seeing the pattern clearly is the same as seeing the whole of life clearly. And those are not the same thing. Schopenhauer takes one very real part of human experience, the repetition of desire, the fading of satisfaction, the constant return to wanting, and he elevates it into the defining truth of existence. But real life is not built from one pattern alone. It is layered, contradictory, uneven, and constantly shifting. There are moments that repeat, and there are moments that change you in ways that do not simply reset back to where you started. The mistake is not that he noticed something dark. The mistake is that he treated that darkness as complete. Because if you look carefully, even within the cycle he describes, something else is happening that his framework cannot fully explain. You do not come back to desire in exactly the same way each time. You're not the same person who started the cycle. Something in you moves, even if the external pattern looks similar. Your understanding changes, your priorities shift, your sense of what matters evolves in ways that are not captured by the idea that everything simply resets. But once you accept his conclusion, you stop paying attention to that movement. You begin to treat repetition as sameness. You begin to treat change as illusion. And that flattens your perception of your own life. Because now, instead of asking what is changing, you assume that nothing truly changes in a meaningful way. You begin to interpret your experiences through that expectation. When something feels important, you remind yourself it will fade. When something feels meaningful, you question whether it is just another temporary state. When something begins to pull you in deeply, you hold back because you already believe where it leads. And this is where the philosophy stops being an observation and becomes a limitation. Not because it is forcing you to do anything, but because it is shaping what you allow yourself to fully experience. You're no longer open in the same way. You're filtering. You are correcting. You are reducing. Always bringing things back to the same conclusion. And over time, that creates a life that feels controlled but narrow. You're not lost. You're not overwhelmed. But you're also not fully engaged. You are moving through your life with a kind of quiet distance that protects you, but also separates you from the intensity that gives life its depth. This is where the idea that Schopenhauer was just depressed starts to make more sense, not as an insult, but as a perspective, because what he describes is not just a neutral structure of reality. It is a way of interpreting experience that places more weight on what fades than on what transforms, more attention on dissatisfaction than on movement, more focus on repetition than on development. It is a lens that leans in one direction and then treats that direction as the full picture. And when you adopt that lens, you begin to lean in the same direction. You begin to see what he saw, not because it is the only thing there, but because it is the thing you're now trained to notice the most. This is why his philosophy can feel so convincing. It aligns with certain experiences you have already had, and then it expands them into a complete explanation. But in doing that, it quietly pushes everything else into the background. It makes other ways of understanding your experience feel less valid, less serious, less real. And that is where you have to step back and question it. Not reject it completely, because there is truth in what he saw, but refuse to let it become the only frame through which you see your life. Because once it becomes the only frame, it doesn't just explain your experience. It limits it. The alternative is not to pretend that desire leads to permanent satisfaction or that life resolves itself into something stable and complete. That would be just another illusion in the opposite direction. The alternative is to recognize that the cycle he describes is only one layer of a much larger process. Desire returns, but you're not the same each time it does. Satisfaction fades, but the experience still leaves something behind. Repetition exists, but it is not pure repetition. It carries variation, change, and movement that cannot be reduced to a simple loop. When you start seeing that, something shifts. You stop treating every experience as if it leads to the same place. You allow moments to have their full weight while they are happening without immediately reducing them to what comes after. You allow yourself to care, to invest, to move toward things without constantly holding back in anticipation of disappointment. And this does not make you naive. It makes you more complete in how you experience your own life, because you're no longer protecting yourself from the pattern at the cost of everything else. You are recognizing the pattern, but you're also recognizing that it does not define the entirety of what is possible. You can feel deeply even if the feeling does not last forever. You can care about something even if it will change. You can move towards something even if it does not resolve everything. And in doing that, you recover something that Schopenhauer's framework quietly takes away. Not meaning as a fixed answer, but meaning as a lived experience. Something that exists in how fully you engage with what is in front of you, not in whether it lasts forever or leads to a final state. This is where the idea of emptiness begins to break. Because what felt empty was not life itself. It was the expectation that life had to behave in a certain way to be meaningful. Once that expectation loosens, even slightly, you begin to see that the value of an experience does not depend on its permanence. It depends on how fully it is lived. And that is something Schopenhauer's system cannot fully hold, because it is too focused on what disappears to account for what unfolds while it is there. So the question is not whether he was completely wrong. The question is whether you're willing to see beyond the part he focused on. Because if you stay inside his frame, life will continue to feel like a loop that never goes anywhere. But if you step outside it, even a little, you begin to notice that what looks like repetition from a distance can feel very different when you're fully inside it. Not because it leads to a final answer, but because it is not empty in the way you were taught to see it. And that difference is enough to change how you live.